Jewish communities will pay the moral price because Israel has lost all moral authority and is universally regarded as a perpetrator of evil. Very few in the world now see the Star of David as anything but the equivalent of the Nazi swastika.
Today I'm joined once again by Ambassador Chas Freeman, a voice of unparalleled clarity in international diplomacy. Someone whose perspective is truly essential in these turbulent times. That's why we are diving into some of the most troubling, interconnected crises of our age, starting of course with Gaza. The atrocities there, the war crimes, the relentless military campaigns, the blockades and the systematic starvation of civilians. It's impossible not to draw chilling parallels to the tactics the Nazis used in Europe during World War II. Yes, it's a provocative comparison, but I have images here on my desktop, images of skeletal, starving children, which bear a striking resemblance to the images we saw after World War II. So graphic that should I choose to include them here, it would result in a ban of this very interview by YouTube. And I know that because I tried. Then we talked about the recent ceasefire in Gaza. It's being framed as a step towards peace, but is it really? As the ambassador aptly put it, it feels more like a temporary pause on genocide. Beneath the surface of this so-called truth lies a tangle of backroom negotiations, which each side spinning its own version of victory, while the people in Gaza continue to bear the brunt of the suffering. What's the real agenda here? Is it about genuine peace, or is it part of a broader deal, perhaps Netanyahu securing a free hand in the West Bank in exchange for a ceasefire in Gaza? Could this just be a political PR stunt, as a prop for Donald Trump's inauguration? And then there are the mediators, Qatar, Egypt, the US. But are they really driving the process, or are there hidden players pulling the strings? Are we witnessing not just an effort to end the conflict, but a calculated reshaping of regional power dynamics, perhaps involving actors and interests that are not yet out in the open? Then we're turning to Syria, the story of Assad's so-called fall, which deserves closer scrutiny. Was it truly a local uprising, or were the external forces at play? Who ordered Syrian generals to stand down, abandoning battle-ready battalions in the most critical moments? Those aren't just questions about Syria. They speak to a broader push by foreign powers to redraw the map of the whole Middle East, exploiting chaos for their own ends. Never waste a good crisis. These are some of the pressing, uncomfortable questions we'll unpack today with Ambassador Freeman. One last thing. Critical voices like the ones you hear on this channel are being actively silenced and suppressed. You may not notice it, you may not know it, you may not even believe it, but it does happen, and I have the statistics to prove it. So if you do value sharp, unfiltered analysis that doesn't follow the mainstream narrative, hit the subscribe button, like and share. It really makes a difference. And for those who really want to keep up with my work, make sure you join me on Substack. No restricting algorithmic filters there, or you can listen on my podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Amazon. The links are in the description below. Thank you. Ambassador Chas Freeman, good morning to you. How are you?
Good afternoon to you. I'm well, thank you. I hope you are too.
Now that I have you on again, I'm more than happy. Thank you. Now, you spent your Sunday morning with me, and today is a kind of special Sunday for two reasons. Well, Sunday, Monday. Today, officially, the ceasefire in Gaza is supposed to take effect, and tomorrow we have Trump's inauguration. So I don't know what this period means for us. What's your guess?
Well, I think the ceasefire, so-called, really isn't a ceasefire. It's a brief pause in the genocide, accompanied by an exchange of hostages. There are three young Israeli women who are to be picked up by the Red Cross, I understand. There was a bit of a delay in the actual implementation of the truce because I assume Hamas has a certain amount of difficulty in coordinating and communicating, and it does not want to reveal the hideouts where the hostages have been kept to the Israelis or their partners in crime, if you will. In any event, the ceasefire is the temporary ceasefire. The pause is in effect. Palestinians are attempting to return to the rubble where they once lived. The forces of Hamas have emerged from underground and are parading, reasserting control. It is perfectly obvious at this point several things. First, the effort by Prime Minister Netanyahu and the extremists around him in the cabinet to achieve the release of the hostages through the use of force has completely failed. This agreement, which was actually reached 9 months ago, basically, and continuously sabotaged by both Mr. Biden and Netanyahu. Joe Biden claims he spent 24 hours a day working on something in Gaza. I think he was working to prevent a ceasefire, essentially. In any event, there is now a temporary ceasefire in effect, and it proves the point that the only way you can deal with a hostage situation effectively is through negotiations. The Israeli government has lost Itamar Ben-Gvir, one of its most extreme fascist elements, the Minister of Police. He has left saying he will come back once the genocide resumes, but he will not be there if the genocide is paused. His companion on the religious Zionist right, Bezalel Smotrich, remains in the cabinet, but only because Netanyahu claims he has received assurances from both the outgoing Biden administration and the incoming Trump administration that he can resume the war of annihilation at will. And I note that the cruelty of this campaign was nicely exemplified by the fact that right up to the moment when the ceasefire went into effect, the Israelis were continuing to bomb and murder people. So what we have here is much less than has been described. It is not a step toward peace. And it is, I must say, fairly easy to predict what will happen. There is a pattern in Israeli negotiating practice, which is quite evident, for example, in the Camp David Accords, but now in this hostage agreement. And it consists of a combination of expediency and deceit. Expedient seizure of immediate benefits in return for some minimal concessions, but most of the apparent concessions are reserved for later phases of a negotiation, which never occurs. And that is the part about deceit. So you get a short-term benefit, a tactical benefit. You appear to make strategic commitments, but those strategic commitments are never implemented. Therefore, we have to go back to Camp David. Part of that was to facilitate self-determination for the Palestinians. Well, that has not happened. We already see Mr. Netanyahu seizing on every excuse he can find to claim that the other side is violating the agreement. This also is a usual Israeli practice to justify their own violations of the agreement, an agreement. So I think we're seeing it will be very fortunate if this truce, if this pause in the genocide actually lasts the 42 days that have been stipulated. I suspect it will not. I think we will see Mr. Netanyahu charge violations by Hamas, and that the murders in Gaza will resume. I guess a final point is, it should be an obvious one by now, and that is that the Israeli objective is to eliminate the Palestinians from Palestine. And their very effective labeling of Hamas as a terrorist organization is a label they have applied to every element of Palestinian resistance to Palestinian displacement or abuse. Whether it was peaceful or violent doesn't matter. It's still terrorist in the Israeli lexicon. So when Bezalel Smotrich says the war must continue until Hamas is eliminated, what he means is exactly what was said at the very early days after October 7th, namely that the objective of the war is to remove the Palestinians, resettle Gaza. And of course, the 42-day truce provides Israel with an opportunity to intensify the pogroms, the persecution of Palestinians, and the eviction of Palestinians under an ethnic cleansing program in the West Bank. So the Israeli cabinet, while it technically approved the deal that Mr. Trump's apparent pressure imposed on them, at the same time authorized the intensification of warfare against the Palestinians in the West Bank. That, I think, is the summary. Now, Mr. Trump is coming to power, as you said, tomorrow, Monday. We don't know what he will do. There are many possibilities. First of all, we don't know what sweetener, if any, Mr. Witkoff, his representative, Trump's representative, provided to Mr. Netanyahu when he read the Riot Act to him on the need to come to grips with the hostage issue. Of course, Mr. Netanyahu benefits from the release of hostages because this reduces internal pressure on him in Israel from the hostage families, who have already, however, begun to demand that the 42 days not be wasted and that additional hostages be released in the interim. He's releasing Palestinian hostages in disproportionate numbers in return for the Israeli hostages. This is not popular, but it is a small price to pay, I think. Mr. Witkoff may have offered Mr. Netanyahu any variety of assurances. Perhaps that the United States would join Israel in an attack on Iran, which Mr. Netanyahu has been trying to engineer for years. Perhaps the assurance that he can break the agreement at any time and the United States will not hold him accountable. In other words, that the Trump administration will be even worse than the Biden administration, which issued a whole series of empty threats to the Israelis and implemented none of those threats. It was all words and no action, no leverage at all applied to Israel until Mr. Trump decided to apply leverage. Now, Mr. Trump set this up pretty effectively. And I will conclude by saying that first, he issued there will be a hell to pay if the hostage issue is not resolved by my inauguration threat, which was presumed to be directed to Hamas. Might also have been directed to Israel. But this gave him the appearance of being a tough guy, even stronger in support of Israel than Mr. Biden. Second, he then played Jeffrey Sachs' video on his channel, in which Dr. Sachs very correctly described Mr. Netanyahu as a very nasty, deceitful person who was arrogant and leading the United States around by the nose. This put Mr. Netanyahu on notice that some tough love was coming to him, and which Mr. Witkoff then administered on Saturday a week ago, the Jewish Sabbath, which Mr. Witkoff, himself a Jew, ignored and forced Mr. Netanyahu, who is a secular Jew and does not observe the Sabbath to me. So now we are left with the question: will the inevitable violations of this so-called agreement by Mr. Netanyahu draw the ire of Mr. Trump? He can anger easily if he feels he is betrayed. He's emotional. He leads with his gut, not his brain. Or has he given Netanyahu assurances that he will back Netanyahu regardless of what he does, which has been his historic posture? If the latter, then this entire thing is revealed as a public relations charade designed to set the frame for Mr. Trump's inauguration tomorrow as president. And in that respect, it resembles the maneuvering by Ronald Reagan and Bill Casey, his CIA director, subsequently campaign manager at the time, to persuade Iran not to release the American diplomatic hostages until Mr. Reagan was in office, and thus discredit Jimmy Carter. So there is a history of skullduggery in American politics, and we can't rule out the possibility that that is all that this is. And I will end here, having spoken far too long.
I start from the back. In the hostages, the American hostages in Iran were released on the day of Ronald Reagan's inauguration, right? So we have a similar, it's very similar even, yeah.
Well, it's
situation.
possible. And, you know, there were, even before that, there is strong reason to believe that Richard Nixon did the same thing to Lyndon Johnson and Hubert Humphrey, his opponent, in the 1968 elections, by talking to the Vietnamese and saying, don't do a deal. A deal was in the works. Don't do a deal with Hanoi. Wait for me. And so the sabotage of a negotiation for domestic political advantage is not foreign to American politics.
Yeah, we have many examples. Now I come back to the very beginning, the ceasefire. Now, when I heard the ceasefire, I remembered something that you told me in one of the previous interviews. Would you want to take a guess what that was, specifically in regards to the ceasefire?
I don't recall at all.
You said something that really stuck with me. And I quoted you a number of times on that. You said that a ceasefire is like handing a glass of water to somebody who is waiting in line for the gas chambers in Auschwitz.
Yes, I remember saying that, and I agree that is pretty much what this is. What is most extraordinary to me is the endless resilience of the Palestinians and their capacity, even under the most dire circumstances, to muster hope. And we're seeing that now. They are hopeful that this will last. I don't see any basis for that hope, I'm sorry to say.
I have people who tell me, Palestinian people who share your vision and my vision, by the way, that this is not going to last. I have also contacts in Israel that tell me exactly the same. They do not believe that this will last.
No, it's controversial in Israel on both two scores. Those few Israelis who oppose the genocide share our view that this is fraudulent and will be violated at will by the Netanyahu cabinet. Those who oppose the pause in the genocide are expressed doubt that it will be resumed. I don't think there's any basis for their doubts given who's in charge in Israel. I note that the departure of Ben-Gvir from the cabinet and the removal of his Jewish Power party from the governing coalition reduces Mr. Netanyahu's majority in the Knesset to 2 votes. So he has even less room to maneuver. But I don't think there's ever been any doubt about his commitment to genocide. So I'm not sure how consequential this really is.
If we look briefly at Trump, I mean, I saw the interview with Biden where Biden kind of, confirmed, the cooperation between Trump and himself. Of course, he tries to paint himself in a positive image. But even if we take into consideration that that might just be a PR stunt for him coming into the office, there must have been a bit more than that, and you hinted this already. So Steve Witkoff, who was in Tel Aviv on the Shabbat, right? So there may have been some concessions, but there may have also been some pressure. And this is where the retweet of Professor Jeffrey Sachs's interview comes in. Is that not? I mean, we both don't have a crystal ball, and we cannot read minds. But there is a message in this over and beyond the obvious, or not?
Well, I don't know that you have to come up with elaborate theories here. The incoming administration basically deserves credit for, if credit is due, for the for producing, as I said, an agreement that, or restoring an agreement that was actually made many months ago under pressure. Mr. Trump is someone whose negotiating style is quite clear. It begins with bluster and threats, hard line. Remember how he dealt with Kim Jong-un in North Korea. Dire threats, exaggerated rhetoric, wild talk, followed then by an effort to reach an agreement. And Mr. Trump has the odd notion that his personality is so charming that if he meets someone, they will inevitably agree with him. And he also has a habit of making phone calls, in which he hears what he wants to hear. And the very good example of that was his telephone call with Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico, the president of Mexico, where what she heard and what he heard appear to have been completely different. So I don't know. The various emissaries of Mr. Netanyahu have been turning up at Mar-a-Lago in Florida to meet with Mr. Trump and coming away reporting that they heard this, that, and the other. I don't know whether they actually heard that or not, or whether Mr. Trump actually intends to do what he may have told them. So I'm not sure that you have to have a very elaborate theory to explain all of this. Mr. Witkoff is apparently a gruff, tough New York realtor, very much out of the world that Mr. Trump came from. And that is not a world that is praised for its ethical standards or its gentility. So I suppose he was a very good envoy to talk to Netanyahu, who is in some ways, like Mr. Trump, a bit of a bully. And bullies generally don't react, don't stand up very well when they are bullied. They are many of them turn out to be a bit of a coward when confronted with a real threat. So that's my take on this. I wish it were otherwise.
You said already the agreement that was now reached, if we can call it that, is very similar to the agreement that was already almost reached in May 2024. And then, of course, there is the question, why was it not already agreed to really in May 2024 when basically the same agreement is now on the table and is agreed upon? So what does that say about Biden and Trump? Can we make it so black and white, Biden and Trump, or has because the situation has not significantly changed, right?
I think it has more to do with Mr. Netanyahu and Israeli objectives than it has to do with anything on the part of Mr. Biden, who is frankly feckless. Mr. Trump, who I don't think really understands either this situation or the one in Ukraine, that is, misconceives both of these things. It's been perfectly obvious to anyone with no bias from the beginning that the Israeli objective was to empty Palestine of Palestinians. They want Palestine to be Palestinian free, and they're prepared to do anything to achieve that. Initially, they thought they could bulldoze the border with Egypt and force everyone over the border into Egypt. This is not acceptable to the Egyptians, and it's not acceptable to the Palestinians. But the notion that somehow Israel harbors a desire to find a basis for peaceful coexistence with the Palestinians is nonsense. They have played on that fiction, that fantasy, for decades. The so-called two-state solution is an example of that sort of fantasy. While it was doing everything possible to prevent the self-determination on the part of the Palestinians, the Israelis continued to pay lip service to some version of some vague two-state solution. This is a propaganda ploy that worked very well for Israel because it kicked the can down the road, as it were. And as I said, it's very consistent with Israeli style. Expedient seizure of immediate opportunities, deferred discussion of other issues, more serious strategic issues, and then a failure one way or another to address those strategic issues at all. So Mr. Netanyahu basically has continuously shown that he cannot take yes for an answer. By the way, that framework that was agreed in May was endorsed by the UN Security Council. This had strong international support. Mr. Netanyahu nonetheless felt free to undo it, which he did.
You said the two-state solution, and I'm looking at a video from this Zionist settler extremist Daniela Weiss. She's a lady, I would say, somewhere between 50 and 60, and she gives a incredible hate speech criticizing the ceasefire. Now, if we talk about the two-state solution, if we consider the status quo, and if we are also considering the fact that a just two-state solution that includes the West Bank, but also some type of settlement in regards to the settlements. I mean, some type of resolution for the settlements, and then you get people like Daniela Weiss. How realistic? I mean, I forgot.
This is the mirror image of what the Nazis did to the Jews. Put them on rail cars, and they will go to some lovely sports camp somewhere to the east. In fact, they're going to their deaths, and that is exactly what that lady, whom I've seen before, espouses as an objective. This is cruel and sadistic, and it is utterly inhuman, and it is all too prevalent in some sections of Israeli society. I mean, we must never forget there are some very decent people living in Israel, and some whom I admire because the atmosphere there is so viciously racist and hateful that it is very brave on their part to speak as they do in humane terms. And I think they exemplify the finest tradition of the Jewish religious establishment of producing people who are ruthless pursuers of the truth and absolutely uninhibited speakers of truth to power. I think of someone like Ilan Pappé, for example, who is living in Haifa. He's a great man, I think. Quite a bit younger than I, although I regard him as an intellectual elder. But he's not the only one. There are others, and but they are a distinct, almost persecuted minority now in Israel. I was very struck by a comment that Pape made that he has been accused, because he opposes genocide, he's accused of being a Nazi. So apparently a Nazi is someone who opposes genocide. This is very Orwellian, I should say. That is, I don't think of Nazis as people opposed to genocide. I think of them as perpetrators. So this is an inversion of truth and falsehood that is quite bold and striking.
To my knowledge, Ilan Pappe lives in the UK, and that's due to his problems that were arising based on a thesis written by one of his students in regards to Tantura. Are you aware?
I'm not sure. I've seen. I'm not. I know he has a seat at a university in the UK. He's often in the UK, but I believe he remains domiciled in Haifa. Perhaps I'm wrong. In any event, he is certainly the target of quite a campaign of smearing, which is the normal technique that Zionists use. Anybody who is remotely critical of Israel, including, for example, the UN, is immediately branded as anti-Semitic. Well, you have to ask yourself, or Zionists should ask themselves, how come they are generating so much anti-Semitism? Maybe it has something to do with what they're doing and how they're behaving. Maybe it has something to do with the unreasonableness with which they approach ethical issues. And that, reinforces my own feeling that Zionism is the negation of Judaism. It is the opposite of ethical reasoning on the basis of the revealed truths in the Jewish sacred literature. And it is the opposite of the pursuit of justice, which is what the Jewish religion greatly emphasizes. So I don't, but Mr. Netanyahu and Israel, by doing what they're doing, are putting the world's Jews everywhere in jeopardy. And that is to say, and you've seen this in the streets in Holland, in the Netherlands, but to the extent that Jewish communities outside Israel are seen to be automatically supporting Israel regardless of what it does, they suffer from moral contagion, and they become the object of opposition, some of it violent. So this is cause and effect, and Israel tries to invert this and claim that what it is doing is a response to anti-Semitism. No, and in some ways, the Israelis actually historically, the Zionists, I should say, have welcomed anti-Semitism. It's their ally because it tends to force people, Europeans or Americans or whoever, to the extent they're convinced that there's anti-Semitism, to seek refuge in Israel, which of course has become the most unsafe place for the world's Jews anywhere. Quite the opposite of what the intent and advertising says. So this is a horror for the world's Jewish communities, and they will pay the price. The rest of us pay a moral price for condoning this, or worse, in the case of the United States, aiding and abetting it. And Jewish communities will pay the moral price because Israel has lost all moral authority and is universally regarded as a perpetrator of evil. Very few in the world now see the Star of David as anything but the equivalent of the Nazi swastika. And so this is incredibly damaging to Israel and to Jewish communities. And Mr. Netanyahu must bear a good deal of the responsibility. Of course, the people around him, Smotrich, Ben Gvir, are out and out religious fanatics. They are the equivalent in Israel of Daesh, of the Islamic State. They are just as guilty of inhumane behavior as people who behead those they regard who disagree with him. And they deserve equal contempt from the world. And I think they're getting it.
Outside of the Western media bubble, for sure.
So
With,
that's a real question, Thomas. It is the collective West which has embraced Israel and defended it. Is Israel now qualified to remain part of the collective West, or has it become something so evil that it cannot remain part of that group? If the collective West supports Israel despite what it's doing, what is left of our claim to moral authority, to the values of the European Enlightenment, to the superior values embodied in international law? Because the net effect of what has gone on, it's been aided to some extent by what happened in Ukraine, Russian behavior as well as our behavior there, has been to destroy the entire fabric of international law, which was painfully constructed beginning in the 18th century, maybe the 17th, if you go back to Grotius, and totally to destroy the concept of the laws of war, and to violate every principle that Europeans once and Americans once claimed as the validations of our moral superiority and our qualifications to lead the world. We have destroyed our own leadership. I don't think it is respected now. The collective West is isolated from the rest of the world. And this connects to the arrival of Mr. Trump, who obviously doesn't like globalization, but has decided to replace it with old-fashioned imperialism. And in the process, look at the question of Greenland and Denmark. He is demonstrating that the so-called Thucydides trap is not something affecting Sino-American relations. It is affecting transatlantic relations. That is, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. I feel very sorry for Prime Minister Frederiksen and her colleagues, as well as for the chief minister in Greenland. This is an open gunboat diplomacy power play, and we thought in the 20th century we got rid of that. Evidently, we did not. The world, instead of resisting the collapse of an international law-bound order, is accelerating the collapse of that order.
Ambassador Freeman, do we have time still to discuss Syria?
Yes, let me say, first of all, the overthrow of the Assad government was engineered, was the culmination of decades of effort by the American CIA in collaboration with the Israelis, with the Turks in the end, to engineer regime change in Syria. The sanctions put on Syria reduced the standard of living to 1/5 of what it had been. The army was not being paid. The whole state was hollowed out, and it fell remarkably rapidly to a very well-trained group of jihadis who now claim that they are liberal democratic jihadis, which is a bit of a contradiction in terms. But they need to say that because they want aid to reconstruct Syria, which desperately needs it. And they want Syrians in Europe and Turkey to return home to help build the country. Having said all of that, we are now in a period in which there is rivalry between differing interests in Syria that could lead to further major conflict. Turkey wants to have a united Syria under its tutelage, in part because it wants to eliminate the Kurdish autonomy within Syria that, in its view, adds to the domestic problem of terrorism from Turkish Kurds. There's an interesting effort being made in Turkey following the Syrian regime collapse and the assertion of Turkish influence over Syria to reach an agreement with Abdullah Öcalan, the head of the Turkish Workers' Party, who's imprisoned, and to reconcile the Turkish Kurds to their continued inclusion in Turkey. But at the same time, there is planning going on to conduct a military operation in Syria, perhaps with the collaboration of the new authorities in Damascus, to bring the Kurds in northeastern Syria to heal. The Israeli objective is the absolute opposite, where Turkey wants a united Syria. Israel wants to fragment Syria. That has always been its objective. It would like Syria broken up into 5 or 6 little kingdoms or statelets, which it could then exercise to divide and rule, remove any threat to its security from Syria, any challenge to its hegemony in the Levant, and retain the ability to strike at enemies over Syrian territory, for example, Iran, without resistance. Now, this is the Israeli objective. The American objective seems to be quite confused. Some Americans clearly are on the side of the Israeli agenda. Others see this in ideological terms and want to see the emergence of a constitutional democracy in Syria. So I don't know how this is going to turn out. It's too early to say. I think the Mr. Shara, who had the nom de guerre al-Jolani from the Golan Heights, is putting on a very good show. There have been far fewer incidents of persecution of Christians, Druze, Shia, Alawites than might have taken place, given the bitterness of the civil war. But it's too early to say whether this is more than a front and whether it can last. So I don't know about Syria. I don't think it's a victory for Israel, although Israel is seizing Syrian territory. This lays the basis for a future Syrian return to hostility toward Israel. At the moment, the new government in Damascus is not resisting the Israelis, mostly because I think it wants Western aid. It doesn't help, by the way, in the connection with rebuilding Syria, that the new government has included several Uyghur terrorists in its military command structure. It has validated the Chinese charge that are Uyghurs who are engaged in terrorist resistance to the Chinese control of Xinjiang, and it has basically created a block to Chinese participation in the rebuilding of Syria as long as it's in power. Then we have crosswinds going on elsewhere. For example, in Germany, suddenly they are concerned about losing Syrian doctors who might return to Syria and who have become the backbone of the German health system. And so they are trying to pass legislation which would allow these doctors to do temporary duty in Syria without losing their German nationality and ability to practice medicine in Germany. I'm sure there are many other contradictions to be revealed, but that is a striking one. So Syria remains a mystery in search of some clarification. And we don't know what Mr. Trump is going to do because, of course, he tried to remove the illegal American military presence from northeastern Syria and was blocked by the deep state, as it is called. And in fact, the Biden administration augmented that force in its last days. It went from 900 to about 2,000 troops. There's a real risk of a clash between them and the Turks. And the Russians are no longer there, of course. But the future of the Russian relationship with Syria is also under negotiation and in doubt. The Russians have dispersed some of the forces they had in the naval port near Latakia, and they have removed people from the airbase there, but relocated to Libya. But they won't give up a position in the Mediterranean. So there's a negotiation going on between Damascus and Moscow about what, if any, role Russian military should have in the Syria of the future. There, I would say one should not discount the fact that for decades, many Syrians were educated in Russia. The human relationships between Russia and Syria are close, and that applies even to the jihadi element. So Russians have a big concern about Syria, which is that if it becomes a jihadi state, if it is sympathetic to Islamist political Islam, then Russia, which has, 15, 17% Muslim population, many of them in areas that are quite restive. We know about Chechnya, for example, Dagestan, and so forth. This Syria could become a real problem for the Russians. That was one reason that they intervened there in the beginning. So lots of questions, no real answers yet.
For me as a behavior analyst, the interesting part was how this all happened. So first of all, and you said it already, there was this kind of ramshackle terrorist organization whose leader actually at the time of the so-called revolution was still on wanted posters all over the world with $10 million bounties on his head. Meanwhile, that's reserved. So this suddenly well-trained group of former or current terrorists took over a country. Whilst at the same time, I have heard Syrian generals complaining that they were instructed to leave complete battle-ready companies behind. All the equipment, battle-ready, they had to leave behind. And at the beginning, they were questioning if these instructions came from Assad or not. Then it turned out it actually came from Assad, which then led some to claim Assad wasn't ousted, Assad was simply fired. Right. And then, of course, we have the fact that a US company, a US PR company, took on the task of rebranding this former terrorist as now a state leader, number one. And you said it already. Interestingly, there was from this group, there comes nothing critical about Israel. So if you take these facts combined, I think it paints a pretty clear picture who benefits or who is behind this whole thing.
Well, I'm not sure who is going to benefit in the long run, but it is very clear that there was a collusion between the United States, Israel, and Turkey to produce this result. And it was facilitated by the fact that both Iran and Russia continuously from about 2018 on counseled Assad to engage in reform. They could see that his regime was losing its capacity, and they urged him to reform, to make peace with the jihadis, to incorporate them, and he declined. And I think, therefore, I don't say he was fired, but I think his two principal patrons, Moscow and Tehran, both told him, you're on your own now. You have failed to do what we urged you to do, and therefore you're on your own. And in the case of the Russians, this was a fairly easy decision, I think, because while Russians are quite good at setting strategic priorities, and this is a secondary priority. Ukraine and European security architecture are the primary objective. In the case of Tehran, this was not an easy decision. And evidently there were offers from Iran to send in Iranian troops to help bolster the regime, which were declined by Assad. He obviously had money stationed abroad and stashed in different places, and he's presumably enjoying a decent life somewhere in Russia. There are all sorts of rumors about his wife and
poisoning. poisoning.
Yeah, exactly. So this is an issue. I don't think many people um, deliberately choose Russia as a place to seek political asylum. The record is not too good. So, at any rate, the international backing for Assad had deteriorated. His regime had been hollowed out. The level of corruption had become almost intolerable. The military were not getting paid, so they engaged in shaking down the civilian population for passage through checkpoints and so forth. And the regime was rotten and it fell. Um, you did not mention the appearance of the White Helmets, who appear to be representing MI6. I mean, let's not discount the British in these matters. The French, too, they have a big role in Syria. So I'm not so much interested in how this happened. It took an enormously long time to engineer regime change in Syria. We began the effort in 1947. Assad family came to power in 1970. That is 55 years ago. It took 55 years to engineer regime change, multiple attempts, and finally it succeeded. But what regime is going to replace it? Years ago, and I apologize if I've mentioned this before, when I was at the Harvard Law School as a very young man, I was 20, Ngo Dinh Diem, the president of the Republic of Vietnam in South Vietnam, was assassinated by the United States. And there was jubilation. And now there will be a decent government in South Vietnam, and there will be some hope, and so forth and so on. And I shared that jubilation. And there was a classmate of mine who was a Cuban who had been captured at the Bay of Pigs in the invasion force and ransomed back to the United States for a tractor. He was in his late 20s, early 30s, and therefore knew a great deal more than I did at age 20. And he asked me a question. He said, "Why do you think the replacement will be better than what was overthrown?" And I've always borne that in mind. Why do we think the replacement in Syria will be better for anybody than what was overthrown? After all, the Assad government gave Israel no trouble. It never supported the Palestinians. For a while, Hamas had a headquarters there, but that ended years ago. It stiff-armed the Turks, who were among those who kept urging Assad to reform, but it really didn't cause the Turks too much trouble. It let them take over part of Syria, basically, and it didn't really challenge the United States. So it was terrible for Syrians. It was a vicious dictatorship, and each of the father and son came into power promising reform, and neither delivered. And each ended his time in office with relying almost entirely on the security forces, torture and imprisonment to retain power. So for Syrians, the removal of the Assad government is a great blessing. Is it a blessing for others? I'm not sure.
We will see if it's a blessing for the Syrian people. I think they were losers then and they are losers again. Yeah. But to conclude this interview, I would like to come one more time back to Brzezinski and his concern that Russia and China and Iran might come closer. Now I have an article in front of me. The article is about the recently signed 20-year strategic partnership treaty between Russia and Iran. And the article says Syria was the catalyst because the recent development in Syria, including the decline of Assad's regime and the weakening influence of Hezbollah, have prompted both nations to deepen their ties. So there are long-term geostrategic consequences to how do we see this? I mean, here in the West, is it a huge thing, the overthrow of Assad? I doubt it, yeah. But there are long-term strategic consequences attached to these kind of events.
Of course, and in the case of Iran, it has been left open to an Israeli attack. The removal of Syrian resistance, Israel's deliberate destruction of all of those weapons that the Assad government directed its troops to stand down from, but leave intact, has removed Syria as an obstacle to Israeli expansion. And of course, I should have mentioned earlier, we're seeing the Israelis now publish their famous religious Zionist map, which shows Israel extending to the Nile and the Euphrates, including parts of Egypt, the Sinai, parts of Saudi Arabia, all of Jordan, all of Syria, all of Lebanon, parts of Iraq. This should hardly be reassuring to Israel's neighbors, and I think it's having its effect. One geopolitical effect of what has happened in Syria and in Gaza is that instead of an anti-Iranian coalition between Israel and the Gulf Arabs coming into being, we're seeing the beginnings of an Iranian coalition with the Gulf Arabs to balance Israel coming into being.
Inclusive
And
Saudi
Iran
Arabia,
has
huh?
also reacted by relaxing the terms of its cooperation with Moscow. This is really quite remarkable because historically Persia and Russia are enemies. Large sections of the Persian Empire were invaded and conquered and occupied by the Tsarist regime in Russia. Similarly, Turkey, which has always been a problem for Russia and vice versa, has now decided it needs a good relationship with Russia. And why? And this is in part to balance events in the Levant and in Syria, the overweening ambition of Israel, and the unreliability of the United States as perceived by the Turks. And you also have, China and Russia, which didn't have any relationship to speak of until about 1640, when they encountered each other in Siberia. The greatest territorial losses to China were to Russia, not to other countries. And yet, this historically hostile relationship has now been transformed into an entente. So why did all this happen? It happened because the United States and laterally NATO as well has drawn up an enemies list, adversaries, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. And by doing that, by putting them all in the same basket, we have created a bloc that is dedicated to eroding our global primacy and hegemony. The same, by the way, is true of the BRICS grouping. That was invented on Wall Street as a financial gimmick. But by putting Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa all in one basket, we helped to create an organization that was first a protest movement and is now an effective balance to overall influence of the collective West. So there's several lessons to be drawn from this. Don't draw up enemy lists. Don't treat people as enemies unless they do things that require that. Don't prescribe enemies. And practice diplomacy, which we seem to have forgotten how to do. There's a second issue, and that is, I believe it was Palmerston, the famous British foreign secretary, who said that nations do not have permanent friends or enemies, they have permanent interests. We seem to reverse that. We have permanent enemies, but no permanent interests. So the Western rivalry with Russia doesn't go away, even if the interests that fueled it have been addressed. What is the reason after the end of the Cold War for enmity between Russia and other Europeans and the United States? There isn't one. So we're not handling things well, and I don't see any evidence that the new regime in Washington is likely to do anything but exacerbate the problems we are having with our role in global affairs.
On that note, Ambassador, you were, as always, very generous with your time. I'm just wondering, is there anything that's close to your heart that you still want something?
I think I'm going to go have Vietnamese pho, which I think is wonderful. The soup, noodle soup. We have a very good, my wife and I met when I was trying to reorganize the U.S. government's refugee function. And this was the era of the Vietnamese boat people. And my future wife was a colleague. There was no romantic attachment, but we came to admire each other. And 14 years later, it was love at second sight. But she worked in the refugee area on the ground in Thailand. Yesterday, we went to a little town in northeastern New Hampshire called Somersworth. And we went to a Thai restaurant there. And she found that the Thai owner was somebody she had helped get to the United States from the Lao border in 1981. And he and his family had been settled in this tiny town in New Hampshire, and they're still there. Now they have opened, he worked in a factory, but now they've opened a very good Thai restaurant. So I've given it a review on Yelp. If you want to look on Yelp, you can see a review of Basil Leaf Restaurant in Somersworth. Anyway.
Incredible story. Incredible story.
Well, the world is much smaller than many people imagine.
Yeah.
We keep running across people who we've met before or inadvertently helped or hurt. I hope there are very few we've hurt. Anyway, have a pleasant evening. Bye-bye.
I will. Thank you so much, Ambassador.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. It really makes a difference. And as said before, if you want to keep up with my work, make sure you subscribe on Substack. In my Substack newsletters, I dig even deeper. I break down tricky ideas, show you practical analytical techniques, and explain how you can use them in your own life. It's free, the link's right below, and I would love for you to join the conversation. Let me know how it's changing the way you look at the world and its people. As always, thanks for your support and see you next time.